Thank you, Bernard. It's a real pleasure to be here, and this is really one of my favorite conferences. So I'm going to be talking about actually a fairly difficult topic, and I'm going to take a rather technical approach to it. And in fact, one of my objectives in this talk is to make a case that the possibility for AIs to develop features that we normally associate with humans, or in the case of sentience with other animals, is that this possibility doesn't really require any new physics or new spiritual or metaphysical results. So in particular, if you're a fan of, for example, panpsychism, this idea that consciousness exists in all physical objects, you're going to be pretty disappointed with what I have to say here. If you're a fan of the pan-computationalism, that the physical world is all a big computation, you're probably also going to be kind of disappointed, because one of my goals is to show that actually we have very good technical reasons to believe that these kinds of mechanisms that we normally find only in humans can very well arise in machines, and possibly even in the machines we are building today. So anyway, that's one of my objectives. So first of all, let me define my terms. So what do I mean by embodiment? Well, these are pointers to a bit of current work in this area of embodied robotics, which is simply robots that are directly interacting with the physical world and using deep neural network technology to in a closed loop form with that physical world. Okay, so embodiment is actually a term that comes from psychology and neuroscience, and it talks about the idea that the mind is actually an interaction rather than a process going on in the brain. It's actually an interaction between the brain and its environment. And embodiment in robotics is proving to be really quite promising, where large language model technologies are being used, for example, to really fairly dramatically improve the performance of robots over traditional control system methods. So that's what I mean by embodiment here. Now, what is sentience? Well, sentience is the ability to experience feelings and sensations, but it's not the same thing as just having sensors, right? So making measurements of the physical world is not really enough for a system to have sentience, because to use the term that psychologists use, in order for it to be sentience, it has to be valenced experience, which valence has the root of that word is value. It's good or it's bad. So the experience that you have has to have value in order for it to be a sentient experience. And that sort of concept is one that, for a computer scientist may be kind of hard to pin down. What do we mean for it to have value? We're used to working with abstract symbolic objects that have no intrinsic meaning and don't have a good or a bad associated with them. And so I have a pretty steep hill to climb here, which is to try to make a claim that we actually do have technical results, and I'm particularly going to be drawing on technical results from computer science that show that some of the properties of sentience are things that we already find in the systems that we're building. So the question I'm being addressed here is, can these machines actually achieve sentience? So first of all, currently animals are the only machines with sentience that we know of. And so this particular image comes from Jeff Lichtman's lab at Harvard, where they did a 3D reconstruction of a really tiny section of a mouse brain. And this is a computer-generated graphic from this reconstruction for this really tiny segment. This is a human hair at the top of this image. Okay, so the little red region down here is the region that we were just looking at the 3D reconstruction of, and this is a human hair. So if you think about a brain the size of a human brain, and you think of it having the kind of complexity that you were just seeing in that 3D reconstruction, it's an extraordinary complex and very chaotic structure. And I'm going to insist, for the purposes of this talk, that it is the properties of that structure that lead to sentience in humans. I'm going to assume there's no spiritual or metaphysical reason. I'm going to take a materialist stance that it is the property of the biology that gives us the sentience that we all experience, okay? Now, the machines that we're building also have an enormous amount of complexity, but if you look at them from a distance, they look really very different from the thing you just saw in that 3D reconstruction. This is a really, truly wonderful web page constructed by Brendan Bycroft that I really recommend going to, even if you're an expert in large language models and neural network technology. This is really worth spending some time with, because on this web page, Brendan has constructed interactive graphics that show the structure of the large language models, and you can really get a lot of insight into how the attention mechanism works and what the architecture is. You know, these three boxes up here give the attention mechanism, and I recommend going through this Nano GPT, which is a really tiny, a small large language model, right? It has only 85,000 parameters, but that gets it down to the level where you can start to really kind of poke around at where all these parameters are in the overall structure. You know, GPT-3 has 174 billion parameters, and each of these little rectangles in here, if you zoom in on this, there's little round dots. The round dots in these rectangles are weights. Okay, so those are the parameters. Each one of these is a real number. Now, if you think about it, this looks like a very regular structure, okay? But you've got 174 billion numbers that are actually defining what is really the structure, and nobody knows how these numbers really relate to one another and yield the results that they do. I would argue that, in fact, if you look at this architecture from the perspective of the interactions defined by these numbers, it's just as chaotic as the brain we were just looking at. Okay, it's just realizing this in the form of numbers stored in a memory instead of in the form of, you know, widths and sizes of synapse connections and gaps in synapse connections and stuff like that. Okay, so it's just a different realization of chaos, but it's just as chaotic. And so we shouldn't infer, just because this architecture doesn't look like the architecture of the brain, that it's not actually capable of having some of the same properties as the brain. So the technical approach I'm going to take is going to build on the shoulders of giants. So I'm going to draw from the results that are due to 4 computer scientists that I have enormous admiration for. So my colleague at Berkeley, Shafi Goldwasser, and Silvio Micali at MIT got the Turing Award for their work on zero-knowledge proofs. Robin Milner got the Turing Award for not the same work that I'm going to be citing here, but the work that I'm going to be talking about from him is actually, I think, just as important as the work that he got the Turing Award for. And then Judea Pearl also got a Turing Award. He got the Turing Award for Bayesian networks. And after he had developed Bayesian networks, he was actually kind of disappointed in what they were capable of. He realized that Bayesian networks were incapable of reasoning about causation. And he was kind of pushing at this issue and wanted them to be able to find some extension to enable them to reason about causation. And he came to the conclusion that reasoning about causation objectively is impossible. And that result is going to feed into this question in ways that might be a little bit subtle. So I ask you to bear with me. So here's a couple of the sort of high-level points that I'm going to try to make. So first, sentience is not externally observable. The fact that I have valenced feelings and that I'm nervous about presenting to you guys, you can, sort of see side effects of it, but you can't directly see or measure the valenceness of those feelings. It's not accessible to you, okay? This makes it, of course, hard to study, but it's a steeper issue, right, that I'm going to address, because some people, I think, well, many people actually, have been, I think, brainwashed by a prevailing philosophy of science that, that anything scientific has to be fundamentally objective, and that the subjective should be banned from science. And I would claim that that is effectively the world of science tying their hands behind their backs and creating a situation where they can't study certain phenomena like sentience. And I'm going to claim that in fact subjective phenomena are already used in very technical ways in a lot of the work that we do in computer science. Okay, so, and in particular, I'm going to show you that there are computer science results that show that knowledge can exist that is not externally observable. The second issue that I'm going to address is that objective observation is not able to distinguish sentience from something that is not sentient. So this means that we're going to have to broaden our scientific way of studying these systems if we're going to try to understand sentience. And in order to bolster this observation, I'm going to draw on work from Robin Milner that shows that systems can behave differently, but no objective observer can see the difference. Okay, so this is a technical result, a very strong technical result that shows that objective observation limits what you can see. Okay? The third point that I'm going to make is that embodiment enables distinguishing self from environment. Okay, so embodiment is not just about the feedback loop between the being, the brain, for example, and the physical world, but it's also what enables my brain to distinguish self from non-self, which means it provides the foundational scaffolding for this sense of self that we all have. Okay, and that sense of self, I think, is a prerequisite to sentience. Sentience, in order to have a valenced feeling, there has to be a self having that sense, that valenced feeling. And for this, I'm going to make a really rather subtle argument that draws on the work of Judea Pearl, which shows that subjective involvement enables reasoning about causation. Okay, so together these suggest that sentience can in fact emerge, and that there are technical precedents in work that in computer science we're reasonably familiar with that we can draw on. But it also suggests that it's going to be extremely difficult to study using objective scientific methods. And so here, I've sort of created a steep hill to climb, because it really is a very strong, prevalent philosophy of science that I think was probably best articulated by Karl Popper in the mid-20th century, that objective is better than subjective. If you collect data, let the data speak for itself, okay? That any conclusions that you draw about the properties of systems should be based on observations of data, and they should be objective observations that don't involve any subjective judgment on the part of the individual observer, okay? This is a prevailing philosophy of science even today, and I think that it needs to be broadened in order to be able to study these kinds of phenomena. Okay, so let's start with the first of these principles. Knowledge can exist that is not externally observable. So here I'm going to draw on the work of Shafi, Goldwasser, and Silvio Micali, which is a result that's known as zero knowledge proofs. And zero knowledge proofs are an interesting idea that, you know, it was a bit of a surprise to a lot of people when it got the Turing Award, but in retrospect, it kind of made a lot of sense. But, you know, when Shafi and Silvio first tried to publish this result, it got repeatedly rejected by mainstream computer science theory conferences. I think they got rejected 3 times for 3 years in a row. They finally brought in another co-author, and on the 4th time finally got the paper accepted. And then people started to kind of understand the concept. I'm going to explain the concept using an argument that is actually really quite a beautiful explanation of the concept. It comes from Jean-Jacques Quiscatier and Louis Guillou. And in the paper that they published giving this explanation of zero knowledge proofs, they include their children as co-authors. And you know, the title of the paper is How to Explain Zero Knowledge Protocols to Your Children. So let me give you their explanation from this paper. All right, so the challenge is, how can one person prove to another that they know a secret while revealing nothing about the secret, and most importantly, without giving that other person the ability to prove to anyone else that they know the secret? Okay, so this is why this is relevant to sentience, is that the person to whom this is being proved acquires subjective knowledge that is not objectively observable. Okay, so this concept of zero knowledge proofs gives a technical argument that subjective knowledge can exist, and can exist in a form that is not externally observable. Okay, so here's how the argument goes. So according to these French guys, the way to explain this is using Alibaba's cave. And I sort of adapted the story and gave a variant of it in this coevolution book, where I named the characters after Shafi, Goldwasser, and Micali, Silvio Micali. So we have Shafi and Micali, and there's a door hidden in the cave that requires a password. And Micali would like to know whether Shafi knows the password, okay? And let's suppose Shafi does in fact know the password and wants to prove it to Micali, but doesn't want to give Micali any extra information. In particular, does not want Micali to be able to convince anyone else that she knows the password. So her goal is to convince Mick that she knows the password without giving Mick the evidence to convince anyone else. All right? The creation of subjective knowledge. So, of course, one way that Shah could prove to Mick that she knows the password is they just both go into the cave together, and she goes in one way and comes out the other. And then it's evident she knows the password. But any external observer now also has evidence that she knows the password. Okay, so this doesn't meet the objective. So here's the way that it would work with zero knowledge proofs. Shah goes into the cave before Mick, and Mick can't see what she's doing. And she just arbitrarily chooses to go down one of these two paths, and then goes and hangs out by the door. Okay? And then Mick comes into the cave and chooses A or B. All right? Just makes a choice, A or B, and calls out A or B. And suppose he calls out A, then Shah comes out and comes out of A. Now, of course, Mick doesn't know whether Shah went in through the B tunnel or the A tunnel. So Mick is not actually sure at this point that she knows the password. But he has at least partial evidence, and he could, if he assumes that her choice and his choice were completely unrelated, okay, this is an important assumption, that these choices are unrelated, then he can say, well, there's a 50-50 chance that she knows the password. Okay, so just repeat the experiment, and then she comes out the correct path again. Now he has a 75% chance that she knows the password. Repeat it again, and you have 82.5% confidence. And you can repeat it as many times as you like and build up your confidence that she knows the password up to an arbitrary level short of certainty. Okay? Mick never becomes certain that she knows the password, but the confidence builds to a point where he says, all right, she knows the password, that's good enough, right? So why is this not then something that Mick could pass on to someone else? Well, if there's an external observer watching this, an external observer might say, the two are colluding, right? They have pre-agreed on the pseudo-random number generator that they're going to use to generate their choices on going into A or B, and consequently, they're just trying to spoof me into thinking that Shah knows the password, okay? So this is why the decoupling, the unrelatedness of their two decisions becomes a very important feature of this. Now, you could have a variant of this, okay? This is, you could have a variant of this where Mick, when he goes into the cave, pulls a coin out of his pocket and flips the coin, okay? And now, if he does that, now an external observer might in fact gain the confidence that Shah knows the password, because the external observer has observed the flipping of the coin and says, there's no way they could be colluding, because somehow Mick would have to make sure that the coin came out the right way each time, okay? So there's a very, very subtle hairy edge distinction here, right? That if Mick uses an overtly random technique that is observably random, then the objectives are no longer met. It's no longer subjective knowledge, but it's actually knowledge that becomes shareable. But on the other hand, if Mick himself is convinced that his choice is independent of anything that Shah might be doing, then Mick gains the subjective knowledge that Shah knows the password, okay? But by keeping it private, how he makes that choice, that knowledge is no longer shareable. Now you might say, well, okay, in the case of humans doing this, you could easily see this coming about just because Mick believes that he has free will, okay? It doesn't matter whether free will actually exists. All that matters is that Mick believes he has free will, okay? If he believes he has free will, he will be convinced that Shah knows the password, right? But of course, in computer science applications of this, nobody ever talks about free will, right? It's not like a piece of software that is using this zero knowledge proof technique has free will and therefore the technique works. No, all that's required in the computer science context is confidence that however the random number is generated by Mick, it isn't somehow being influenced by Shah, okay? So there's a lot of subtle trickinesses in computer programs in generating truly random numbers. It's a whole fascinating field, right? But you have to be sure that somehow the number being generated is in fact not being influenced. And as long as you're sure of that, you will gain this confidence that, that the password is in fact known. Okay, so this gives really a technical argument that it is possible to create knowledge that at a very fundamental level is not externally observable. All right, the essential features of this is that it requires first-person interaction, right? This idea of interaction is really central here. Interaction is very different from objective observation. Objective observation means you watch but don't influence. But no, here there's actually interaction going on, and interaction is a key property. It's also interesting that there's always this residual uncertainty. And of course, the role of randomness and the relationship to free will I find absolutely fascinating, and I elaborate quite a bit more on that in my book, but you can have a look at it there. So, is this knowledge really not externally observable? So, here I'd like to turn to really the second technical argument, okay, which is really that interaction is fundamentally more powerful than observation. That you can do stuff with interaction that cannot be done with objective observation. And here I'm going to draw on results from Robin Milner. Okay, and these are again very technical results. So we can model this cave with automata theory, something that I think is very familiar to a lot of the Isola crowd in the room. So here's a couple of interesting features. So MIC can be modeled with this very simple four-state automaton where he starts outside the cave, transitions to inside the cave, and then calls out a choice, A or B. This will be a non-deterministic choice, A or B. All right? Now, if Shafi doesn't know the password, then Shah will start out outside the cave, will non-deterministically transition to inside A or inside B, okay? And then when Mick calls out the A or B, then she will transition, but really has no choice at this point. So if she doesn't know the password, she's going to be stuck producing a possibly wrong answer. If Shafi knows the password, then if she chooses to go inside B, like she did in my animation, then regardless of whether Mick calls out A or B, she can transition appropriately and produce the right answer. Now, those of you who are familiar with Milner's results will probably immediately recognize that these three state machines are language equivalent, which means objective observers can't really tell the difference between them. But this first state machine and this third state machine are bisimilar. And that is a very strong relationship between these machines, and that bisimilarity is actually something you construct with an interactive procedure. So, interestingly, the essential difference between these two state machines is whether the production of A or the production of B is resolved early or late. Okay? If you look at sort of the fundamental philosophical debate about free will, this debate can really be couched in terms of when the resolution of alternatives happens. Right? If there is no free will, and if the world is deterministic, then all of our choices were determined at the time of the Big Bang. That's this situation. You have the Big Bang, and then all your choices are predetermined. If you do have free will, you retain after the Big Bang the possibility to make multiple decisions. Okay? So one of the interesting observations that I elaborate on in my book is that it's actually impossible to tell objectively whether a system has free will or not. Cannot be done objectively. But anyway, that's a little side argument. So the key argument from Robin Milner has to do with this bisimulation relation. All right. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but part of the reason that I bring this to this audience is that I know that there's enough of you in the audience who actually know how this works. For those of you who don't, you'll just have to take my word for it, right? But when you construct a bisimulation relation, which is a determination that these two machines are bisimilar, the procedure that you use is an interactive one. The two machines have to trade turns. They engage in a dialogue, okay, where both are participating in the dialogue. It's an interaction. It's not one machine watching the other. It's not an observer-observed relation. The interactive part of it is an essential feature of this bisimulation relation. So the other thing about it is that when you construct a bisimulation relation, it's actually a relation between the states of the state machine, okay? You can't actually construct a bisimulation relation unless you know the structure of the state machine. And in the scenarios that I'm interested in, including the Micali case, you're not sure until you know that she knows the password that this is the structure of the state machine. So you can't actually construct a bisimulation relation without making a presupposition about the conclusion you're trying to draw, which is really problematic, okay? But you can experimentally give evidence of a bisimulation relation by doing repeated experiments on the interaction. And you never achieve complete certainty doing that, but you get more and more convincing evidence that there is a bisimulation relation between these. Okay, so that's another kind of interesting feature. And in my book, I try to lay this out much more completely. So, including, you know, if you've never heard of bisimulation relations, I give a gentle introduction to them in this coevolution book. So if you're intrigued by this, I suggest getting that book. By the way, it's open access, so I'm not selling something here. Okay, so there's also a weaker relation called a simulation relation. You can construct a state machine that represents Shafi guessing the password. And here, the simulation relation is an observer-observed relation, okay? It's if this machine is watching this machine, okay, as an observer, as opposed to interacting with it, this machine can always match the moves of this machine. And vice versa. If this machine is watching this machine, then this machine can always match the moves of this machine. So each machine simulates the other. From an observer-observed relation, they're completely symmetric, okay? But this machine is not one corresponding to Shafi knowing the password. It's one corresponding to her guessing the password, okay? So this observer-observed relationship is insufficient for being able to distinguish Shafi knowing the password from her not knowing the password. So the conclusion here is that objective interaction is weak. That by insisting that science be based on only objective interaction, we're saying science is unable to tell the difference between machines that are actually different. We don't want to do that to science, right? That's a mistake. Don't tie science's hands behind its back, right? We would like to be able to tell the difference between machines that are different. And we know from computer science results that that requires interaction, not just observation. So interaction means first-person involvement. You need a self. You need to be part of the game, okay? So this ties into this notion from psychology called embodied cognition. So it says that cognitive function arises from first-person interaction. And so Esther Tellin was the first person really to put this idea on fairly solid ground within the field of psychology. Now, the field of psychology is not like computer science. They don't prove theorems quite as often. But she made this whole idea respectable for the first time. It had been floating around before that, and she made it respectable. And my favorite quote from her work, from her 2000 book called Grounded in the World, is the mind simply does not exist as something decoupled from the body and the environment in which it resides. So think about this. You know, many people assume that the brain is a computer. It's just sitting there processing sensor data and producing outputs in response to the sensor data. You could be a mind in a vat. All that sensor data might just be simulated for you, and the embodied cognition people say bullshit. That's not actually how it works. They say that actually the mind arises from the interaction and from the feedback loop. The fact that when you take action in the physical world, it affects what you sense. So you not only sense to act, okay? You don't just take sensory input and then act in response, but you also act to sense. You take action to improve sensing. This idea is actually an old one. It first came up in the mid-1800s in a very nice book where there was a nice thought experiment given, I've forgotten the name of the author, I apologize for that, but, oh, I have it in my notes. It's Johann Georg Steinbuch, working in Erlangen in Germany, okay, in the early 1800s actually. So in his book, he describes a thought experiment where you hold out your hand and you're blindfolded, and someone rolls around a spoon in your hand. And you can kind of tell there's a cold metallic object, but you can't tell it's a spoon. But if you grasp it, you instantly know it's a spoon. Okay? This is the act to sense, and it's that feedback loop. The fact that your brain knows what you're doing with your motor neurons and correlating that with the sensory feedback that creates the cognitive knowledge of what this thing is. Okay? So the idea of embodied cognition is that all of cognition is this. It is this. It arises from and is this interaction. It's not just a background process going on in a computer. Okay? So my thesis here is that qualitatively different AIs will arise when you give them sensors and actuators in the physical world and when you close this loop where they're acting and sensing at the same time. Now, it turns out that we already have this phenomenon in some of the machines. So there's this act to sense mechanism in the terminology of neuroscience. They call this efference feedback, okay? Where if you take action, your brain tells your motor neurons to do something. So my brain is telling my arm to wave over here. And my vision system is detecting a whole bunch of motion in my peripheral vision, but I'm not panicking, right? If I were not issuing this motor efference and my peripheral vision detected that motion, I would be panicking. I would say, what the hell are you doing, Bernard? But that's not what happens, right? There's this closed loop feedback system, right? We use this all the time. In fact, it's built into the most primitive animal nervous systems, but we use it for speaking. In fact, hearing impaired people who have been hearing impaired all their lives have a tremendous amount of difficulty speaking. Why would that be, right? I mean, it's a completely different set of biology that produces sound versus the biology that hears it. But actually, your brain is constantly working in a feedback loop where you issue these motor efferences to force air through your vocal cords, shape your mouth, and so forth. And your ears your ears pick up the sound, and your ears compare the sound against what they expect, and they realize, oh, it's not quite correct. They adjust the output, okay, and they do it instantly in a closed loop system. So you're constantly correcting the sounds you're making on the basis of what you're hearing, right? So you issue these motor efferences, they get fed back into a learned expectation model. This is learned by the brain, okay? In a baby, the baby discovers that there's a relationship between what goes on in the brain to make the arm move and what goes on in the eyes to see the arm moving. That's a discovery. That's not built into the wiring, okay? And the baby's brain starts to get a notion, oh, this is mine. This sense of self emerges from this phenomenon. This thing that is waving around here belongs to me, and it's the construction of this notion of me in the brain is what is happening when that's going on. Now, we have machines that do this, okay? Many of you probably have these beautiful, smart speakers or even just small compact speakers, right? That, loudspeakers when I was growing up used to be passive objects, right? They were beautiful instruments with no feedback at all, right? And the whole objective, it was quite an art to construct a loudspeaker that sounded good. Now, you buy a little itty-bitty box like this with a really crappy actuator, and it sounds great because it's implementing this efference feedback. It's got a microphone in it. The old loudspeakers didn't have microphones in them, and so they didn't have this feedback mechanism. So this efference feedback mechanism exists in the most primitive nervous systems. So this is a C. elegans worm. This is probably the most studied organism on the planet. It's fully mapped nervous system. The nervous system has only about 300 neurons. The total animal has only about 1,000 cells, somatic cells, the non-germline cells. And so it's a relatively small thing to study. But with 300 neurons, it can already make a distinction between an external stimulus and a stimulus created by its own motion. Interestingly enough, this actually extends out into societies of these worms. The worm can tell the distinction between a touching of another worm of the same species versus a touching from some external stimulus. So this notion of embodied cognition has actually been extended by psychologists into societal structures as well, not just individual structures, where you also have this feedback mechanism. So interestingly enough, studies of the neural structure of these worms have actually led to significantly improved designs for deep neural network controllers. This is a paper based on a collaboration between mostly MIT and people in Vienna, where they built neural network structures inspired by the C. elegans and showed that they could have 2 orders of magnitude fewer neurons and match the performance of a simple unarchitected brute force deep neural network. So 2 orders of magnitude reduction in the number of neurons needed to match the performance. So embodied robotics is a whole field that is working on exploiting this idea of efference feedback. And some of the early work comes from Josh Bungard, who's at the University of Vermont, although when he started this work, he was at Cornell. But he did some really beautiful work, and this is one of the early robots that he created. And what this robot was about was that it was not pre-programmed to do anything at all, except make random motions, and then it had sensors feeding back into it, okay? And they built into the software an objective function where they wanted the robot to be able to move, to change its position, to learn to walk, okay? But they didn't teach it how to walk. And instead what they did was created this feedback loop where it learned how to walk. And in fact, it did so in such a way that it remained adaptive. So if you took this robot and ripped off one of its legs, after it had learned to walk, it would flail around for a while and then learn to walk again with the remaining 3 legs. Or if you took one of the legs and attached a really heavy weight to it, it would again flail around for a little bit, but then learn to adapt, all right? And so this is a principle that's being used in robotics to significantly improve the capabilities of robots. So this notion of embodiment, it enables feedback, interaction, subjectivity, a sense of self, and maybe even free will, okay? That question is a rather treacherous one, and I go into it in quite a bit of detail in this book. But the key thing is interaction is more powerful than observation. Interaction requires a first-person self. And a first-person self requires interaction, so that even these concepts are tied together in a tight feedback loop. So feedback has been around for a while. This is Harold Black as a young man and as an older man. And in the 1920s, Harold Black realized, he was working at Bell Labs, and at the time they had figured out that you could make these vacuum tubes that would take a very small electrical circuit and tremendously amplify it, okay? Vastly increase the voltages and currents. But the vacuum tubes were highly nonlinear, so the resulting signal didn't really have the same shape as the original signal. So Black realized that by putting these in a feedback loop, if you sacrificed a factor of 10,000 of gain, say, you could improve the fidelity of the signal by a factor of 10,000. You could get an output signal that had almost exactly the same shape and was significantly larger than the input. This is how all amplifiers are designed today. And this feedback mechanism is, I emphasize that at its fundamental core, it's a completely self-referential system. There's no time delays involved, okay? It's a zero delay loop in the theory, of course. In practice, there's always time delays in the physics, and that actually sort of, degrades the behavior to some degree, but not a whole lot if you keep the time delays small. But this kind of tight feedback loop starts to create complications with the notion of causation, right? Causation is, that anything that happens was caused by something else, but what caused the something else that caused that, and what caused the something else that caused that? Well, in the theory of feedback loops, the causation loop gets closed, okay? The thing that was caused becomes the thing that causes, okay? That's a really interesting thing about feedback. And this notion of causation, of course, has been pursued in its relationship with feedback for quite a long time. Norbert Wiener's term cybernetics is fundamentally inspired by the feedback loops of control systems. And Wiener believed that, in fact, that these feedback loops were actually central to cognitive function in animals and as well as in machines. So, in contrast, for the computer scientists in the room, Turing machines don't have any interaction. Okay? You present inputs, you crank for a while, you get outputs. Okay? As soon as you introduce interaction, you're outside the theory of Turing church computation. What we actually do with computers is actually richer than Turing machines because we do make computers have interaction. In fact, we are even making computers these days that have embodiment, right? They're interacting through the physical world. These are actually fundamentally richer than Turing machines, and Turing machines fall more in the category of this objective observation. They have the same limitations that objective observation has. So, what is a first-person self? Well, so sentience is this ability to experience feelings and sensations, but you need a what or a who to do the experiencing. How do you define that what or who? Okay, so the core idea here is that this notion of efference feedback enables a machine, be it biological or some other implementation, to distinguish self from non-self, okay? The last point that I want to make is perhaps the most subtle of all, which ties into this notion of causation, which is that it is this efference feedback in more complex animals like us that gives rise to a sense of causation, the ability for this self to act with consequences. Okay, the fact that our actions have consequences is, I think, a elaboration of this efference feedback. Now, causation is something that I think is hardwired into probably all of us. In fact, I kind of have a theory about why that is, but I think I'd be willing to wager that everybody in the room is really quite convinced that anything that happens has a cause. And I think it's actually prevalent throughout humanity. People really are deeply tied to this idea. But Bertrand Russell, 112 years ago, made the claim that there's nothing in physics that supports that conclusion. And here's the quote. I know this is too small for you guys in the room to read, so I'll read it for you. So, all philosophers of every school imagine that causation is one of the fundamental axioms or postulates of science. Yet, oddly enough, in advanced sciences such as gravitational astronomy, the word cause never occurs. The law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone era, surviving like the monarchy only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. Okay? A very colorful expression of this doubt. But there is a lot to this, and actually recent results in physics have demonstrated pretty definitively that you can create situations where you have two events that occur, A and B, where A causes B and B causes A, and there's no other causes. Okay? And if you want to look that up, look up indefinite causality in the quantum physics literature, and you'll find recent experimental evidence of this fact. We think of cause as even being built into Newton's laws, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. You think of that as, well, the force causes the acceleration. But that's only because we named that variable force. And we chose that name because we believed in a cause. But that's not what the math says. The math says that there's a relationship between mass and acceleration. And we call that ratio force. And that's all the math says. The math says nothing about causation. Very direct evidence of that is that Newton's laws are all perfectly time reversible. And so if they were describing causation, that wouldn't make any sense. So this notion of causation, I believe, arises fundamentally from efference feedback. It arises from our biology. Okay, and the fact that we're so wedded to it is a consequence of our biology. This conclusion is supported by Judea Pearl, the last of the Turing Award winners, I will cite. So Pearl has shown that you cannot reason about causality by objective observation alone. Okay? So again, further proof that the scientific method of insisting on objective observation is precluding something rather important. Okay? So there's this wonderful book called The Book of Why. So Judea Pearl actually published a book in the 1990s on this, and it's a very difficult read. It's a lot of statistics and a lot of math around this idea, and really a slog, frankly. But in 2018, he teamed up with Micali, who is a popular science writer, and together they wrote a really fabulous book called The Book of Why. I really recommend, if you haven't read it, you should read it. This is on the must-read list. The Book of Why, it's called. And in this book, he shows that causality you can't reason about causality objectively. And he gives a really beautiful pair of examples. Okay, so I want to emphasize that Judea Pearl is a very sophisticated computer scientist and statistician, right? He got the Turing Award for his work on Bayesian networks. This is not a wacky idea, all right? But the example is a little bit wacky, okay? So in this example, he says, suppose you have a hypothesis that in kids, increasing shoe size causes increasing reading ability. Okay? And you want to make measurements to decide whether or not this hypothesis is defensible. And so you collect a bunch of data and you find, sure enough, wow, reading ability and shoe size are really correlated. So at least your data doesn't seem to disprove that this causation exists, right? Correlation doesn't imply causation, so it could be the other way around. It may be that increasing reading ability causes your shoe size to increase. That's also a possibility. That would also be supported by the data, okay? But either way, you know, there seems to be the possibility, at least, of a causation relation. Now, of course, any statistician would say, no, 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 wait a minute, you're just doing this all wrong. You need to control by age. Okay, so take the kids and put them into bins. You know, the ones born in January of this year go in one bin, February of this year go in a different bin. And now look at the correlations within each bin and you'll find that the data is not correlated anymore, which then disproves a causation. Okay, good enough. So you're using objective, reasonably objective statistical methods to disprove a causal relationship. Okay, so now let's do another experiment which could result in data that looks very, very similar, where you have a hypothesis that ugliness causes talent in actors and actresses, okay? So you collect a bunch of data and you find there's no correlation, that the ugliness of the actors and actresses and their talent don't seem to correlate at all. So it seems that there's no causal relationship. But then you think about it from a statistician's point of view and say, well, maybe I should control by celebrity. So I take all the famous actors and actresses and put them in one bin. The slightly less famous ones, put them in a different bin. Slightly less famous, put them in a third bin. Okay? Create this controlled binning. And now all of a sudden you find there is a correlation. Okay? That the very famous actors that are ugly are really pretty talented, and some of the really beautiful ones are not so talented. Now, I don't know how you measure this thing. You can ask Judea Pearl how you would measure this, but anyway, this is the example that he gives, right? But so the observation that he makes is that, well, okay, as an objective statistician, for this guy, I want to control by age, and for this guy, I do not want to control by celebrity. How do I make that choice? To control or not to control? And he says there's nothing in the data that can guide that choice. There's no way for anything to be in the data to guide that choice. The only way you can guide that choice is by a subjective presupposition about causation relations. And these are drawn with arrows here. You subjectively assume that age causes reading ability and that age causes increasing shoe size. You subjectively assume that talent causes celebrity, opposite direction, okay? And beauty causes celebrity, opposite direction again. The direction of these causation arrows is what guides whether you should control for the third variable or not. But it's a subjective judgment, okay? You can't make that judgment objectively. So he calls age here a confounder and celebrity as a collider. And he says you control for confounders, you do not control for colliders. But you have to make that subjective judgment about those causation relations before you can decide whether it's a collider or a confounder. All right, so he draws the conclusion that in fact you cannot fundamentally reason about causation objectively. There's a bit more that I can say about this, but one of them is that, you know, there is a way to manage the process of handling confounders and colliders at the same time in statistical experiments. It's called a randomized control study. So in a randomized control study, you intervene. There's an interaction again, okay? Again, objective science does not allow this, okay? But you interact. You actually force for example, a certain subset of your population to receive a treatment and another subset to receive a placebo. You got to make sure that you choose these subsets randomly, right? If you let the experimenter choose them with free will, then you might end up with a situation where only the experimenter becomes convinced of the causal relation, just like what we saw with zero knowledge proofs. Okay? You might in fact create only subjective knowledge and not objective knowledge. But on the other hand, if you ensure that it's very visible that the intervention is randomized, then you do in fact create more than subjective knowledge that can be shared. So there's a relationship again here back to the zero knowledge proofs. These arguments are obviously really quite subtle, and I try to lay them out more fully in this book. But the essential point is that really first-person interaction can accomplish things that remain inaccessible to a third-person observer. Okay, that's really the bottom line. So let's just kind of summarize. Sentience is not externally observable, and hence it becomes hard to study. But sentience, when I have a valenced feeling, I feel pretty good about this talk. I think it's gone okay. That's a valenced feeling, okay? You can't really directly observe that, but it exists, okay? Objective observation cannot distinguish sentient from not. As far as you know, you might be just, seeing a machine that is just an automaton producing these statements. But systems exist that behave differently and no objective observer can see the difference. Embodiment enables distinguishing self from environment, which is a key part of what it enables this notion of causation, okay, which then, enables this notion of self, which is when you've got this notion of self, you can start to talk about a self actually being able to have properties like valenced feelings. So together these suggest that sentience can in fact emerge in machines, but that they're going to be extremely difficult to experimentally demonstrate, and using the classical objective methods of science are not going to be sufficient. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a nice talk. So we have time for questions. So we take the keynote from the morning. So wonderful.
Thanks very much for the talk. I have a question about slide 35 and whether there is a distinction between two claims that appeared there. So the first one was the main thesis by Judea Pearl that you can't reason about causality on an objective basis alone, right? And is that different from the other claim that causal relationships are therefore subjective? Because as far as I understood you, you say, whether or not you pick age, the colliding or confounding factor, requires some kind of subjective presupposition that you called it. But from there, you can use objective statistics again. So it's just about picking the thing, then you use the objective methods, and that wouldn't rule out that the causal relationships themselves are objective. So I wonder whether there's this distinction between subjectivity at the level of the investigation and subjectivity at the level of the object of the knowledge.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, these are also causal relations that you could treat as hypotheses and then apply experimental methods to them. But you're going to have the same problem again, where you're going to need to decide whether their relationship with some third variable is a collider or a confounder to know whether to control for that variable. And there's always third variables in any interesting relationship between two things. And so the argument I think that Pearl would make if he were answering this question would be, you get an infinite regress, and it doesn't really help you to solve the problem. But I mean, he really makes this case much more strongly in the Book of Why, so I really recommend reading it. And, you know, it's a very thought-provoking case.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this was really fun and really interesting connections. I wanted to first just give as a small comment, since you gave all the honors of all these other people, since Bertrand Russell is one of my heroes, he did win the Nobel Prize, so we have another prize winner in the talk. That was just my silly comment. So one part that I found especially interesting was the things you were saying about this sense of self coming from an ability to interact with one's environment and learning to distinguish between oneself and the environment. So this kind of resonates with things that I've read and written, but it's been a while, in philosophy of mind and philosophy of perception. So I thought it would, yeah, it's kind of, I find it very plausible that you kind of build up from, yeah, you interact with the environment. But then one distinction I wanted to put to you and see what you think of it, this one that's emphasized by Tyler Burge, is this idea, well, you have to distinguish between kind of sensory capacities in a sense that, if I remember it correctly, things are not sentient, but not yet, and then actual perceptual capacities, where you have a distinction between a subjective self, really, and an objective environment. And then he has all this stuff on perception having these perceptual constancies, for example, where things keep looking the same size even though you could move farther away or closer to them. And what I would think, but I mean, I don't, as you say, it's very hard to say something very well informed about it, is that kind of a real sense of self is maybe something that's beyond a poor little worm. But if once you get to actual like objective representation of an objective environment, that's when you get in the neighborhood of like having some sense of subjective self, because that does seem to ping pong off each other. Yeah. So that's my thoughts on that. I'm curious to see what you think about this.
Yeah, I think that it's a very deep topic, and as you point out, there's been a lot of work in the literature. The work that I'm most familiar with is the notion of intentionality due to John Searle, right, which really puts front and foremost the notion of a mind constructing a model of its environment and then using that model as an intrinsic part of its reasoning about itself and its interaction with the environment. I feel like that a lot of what I've seen in the literature takes this notion of the model of an environment much too literally. And I think that the large language models are showing us that, right? It's very hard to find in those 173 billion learned numbers anything that looks like, oh, this is my model of a building in a room that I need to navigate through. I don't know where those are. And I think we have to be cautious, I think, to not take this too literally. I'm not sure whether the literature that you're referring to falls into that trap or not, but...
I don't think they do, but yeah. I also haven't read it in a while, so I would have to read it up on it to be certain, but I don't think that's the story. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This was very interesting. I wish you could help me, though, understand two things. One is whether what you call interaction is more than scientific experiments, where the experiment does change, that does do something in the world and then observes it, not purely observing. And the second question is, did you try to argue that there is a reason to believe that sentience will develop, or only that if it develops, then we can't know that we won't detect it by simple observation that is not interactive?
Now I'm suffering from your problem. What was the first question? Don't give me two questions at once. Give them to me one at a time.
So let's start with the last.
Okay. What was the last?
Okay, the last was, did you, other than saying...
whether...
Yeah.
Okay, I remember it. So, no, I don't feel like I'm in a position to say that sentience will emerge, or even that it's how likely it might be, or anything like that. Have been, I think, like many people in the field, just continually blown away by what the AIs have been proving themselves capable of. And I feel like, I understand the underlying technology pretty well, and I continue to be blown away by, the next new innovations. And so I don't feel like I'm in any position to make any predictions here. The only point I was really trying to make is that in some sense, that our notions of the philosophy of science may be getting in our way of understanding these phenomena, and that we need to realize that and find ways to kind of augment what we're doing. And now I remember your first question because it's connected, right? So in fact, the purest form of this philosophy of science that I'm putting up as a straw man due to Karl Popper is actually unachievable, because there is no experiment that doesn't interfere with what's being measured. So we know that from quantum physics, and so it's really a little bit of I think perhaps a philosophy that has served us well for a period of time, but is now getting in our way. And so I think we need to kind of augment our thinking a bit.
Thanks for the talk. I was puzzled by a remark you made about feedback. Feedback being, if I heard it right, was instantaneous. It might be instantaneous in the quantum world, but in the real world, for amplifiers and so on, it's not really instantaneous. So can you help me explain what you meant by that, or for which argument you used that?
Yeah, so in a previous life, I used to be a signal processing guy, and I used to teach classes on introductions to control theory. And when you introduce control theory and this concept of feedback control, we always introduce it with zero delays. And the theory is really quite beautiful. So the mathematical models are about zero delays. And you're right that because of fundamental properties of physics, any interaction between two physically separated objects incurs some time delay, unless you resolve Bell's theorem by throwing out locality, right? But it seems to be a property that those time delays are inevitable. But they can become arbitrarily small as the objects get very close together. And so when you start looking at interactions between closely spaced objects, the time delays become not very useful in understanding the behavior. And I think if you look at the theory of control systems, the whole way that the theory is developed is without those delays.
But that's theory, that's not reality.
It's a theory, but to some degree, we can only talk about models. We can never really talk about reality.
So the question I wanted to ask maybe has been asked, but this question is so long I didn't really understand what you're asking. So my question is, consciousness and sentience, are they the same thing? And then I have a second. If we have a robot... No.
I'll forget the first by the time you ask the second.
It's a short.
Okay.
If I have a robot there, so do you mean that we will never know robot will have consciousness or sentience? Because it's not observable.
Yeah, so consciousness and sentience, I don't think, they're related, but I don't think it's not useful to think of them as the same thing. And the reason I chose to focus on sentience is that I think we can be pretty sure that sentience exists in, pretty much all animals at some level, even at the C. elegans level, right? I think, the reaction that the worm had to this external stimulus was very abrupt, and it's not, as I have said repeatedly, it's not directly measurable, but it seems to be an indication that the worm didn't like it, right? So that's an indication of a valenced feeling. Consciousness, I don't think the worm has anything even vaguely resembling that. So, but there is this whole theory of panpsychism that says that not only does the worm have some measure of consciousness, but so does this remote control, this table here, everything does. And in fact, this theory says that because consciousness has emerged from physical biological objects, and there's nothing in physics that could possibly explain it, this must be a new thing in physics, and so consciousness is a new fundamental phenomenon that is on the same level of quarks and energy, and anyway, it's a wacky theory.
Okay, it's back. Cool. I'm happy I get the chance to ask another question. So I was wondering, and that's probably where I'm just too far away from all the zero knowledge proof stuff and from that kind of theory, but I was wondering, at least in that example of Alibaba's cave that I felt that I understood, in what sense I can't know that Mick was his name, I think, knows when he tells me that Shafi knows the password. Because, that's how I often know things, that people tell me things. I do see that there's a difference between being able to make the same observation, and I guess I could go into that cave. But with most of the stuff, I'm listening to you guys saying all these smart things, I then would say, yeah, I know some of this stuff at least afterwards. Because we know a lot of stuff by testimony, so here my epistemology comes in. So I guess I'm just not confident what really is the essential difference, which kind of thing should I highlight in my mind to really get what's going on here.
So zero knowledge proofs fall roughly in this category of computer security, and one of the requirements for working in computer security is that you have to be paranoid, and you have to not trust anybody. And so if Mick tells you that the Shah knows the password, you're going to say, maybe.
So I think Wang posed you two questions, but you only answered one. The other question was whether you want to say that we will not be able to distinguish whether a machine has sentience or not, right?
Right. Yeah. So I guess this, as a consequence of this phenomenon being something that isn't directly externally observable, that we can only get indirect evidence of it, I feel like, any conclusions that we draw about sentience in the machine are going to fall into this category of things where we might be able to build up a certain amount of confidence, but it's never going to reduce to the notion of what we would mathematically call a proof. That was the essential point that I was trying to make. And so, but there could be considerable evidence, right? If ChatGPT runs screaming out of the room when you say something offensive, that might provide evidence that that somehow ChatGPT didn't like it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's, a computer security person wouldn't conclude that ChatGPT didn't like it.
Great. Another question about the difference between interaction and observation. if the system and the environment are stable, then you might ask Bernard that interaction and observation are more or less equivalent, but interaction is much more efficient. So, what's your view on that?
I think that Milner's by-simulation relation shows definitively that interaction and observation are not the same thing at all. That there is a fundamental gap between these. So, and that's in the context of a theory in which you do have proofs. And so, I think for me they really are different. And I think there's other people who have, expressed this, I think, much more elaborately. But
observation long enough, iterated and so on, it's very much the same as interaction. You see the results of every experiment of interaction in the long chain of observations. So that was my argument.
So
both systems are the same, environment and system, or I don't see much of a difference, except for efficiency.
Well, there's a symmetry, so maybe that's what's bothering you, in the sense that when you have interaction, there's always more than one participant, and they're both engaged in the interaction.